Hi, so this lecture is on cellular respiration and the goals for this module. You want to understand how ATP is used in creating energy for organisms. We're going to learn about how heterotrophs use organic compounds to break down to make ATP. And I want you to be able to recognize the chemical equation representing cellular respiration. In addition, I think it's a good idea for you to know where each of these different processes take place. So let's start with the structure of ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and it's thought of as sort of life's renewable battery. So we've got this molecule that's composed of four different parts: an adenosine, which is a nucleic acid, and three phosphate groups. These phosphate groups have got phosphorus and oxygen in them. Now, between the different phosphate groups are phosphate bonds, and as you might recall from earlier in the semester, covalent bonds contain energy, and ATP has got a high amount of energy. If that last phosphate at the end of the ATP molecule is pulled off, it can release a small packet of energy, and our cells will use that small amount of energy to power chemical reactions. Now, the ADP, or the adenosine diphosphate, that's made as a result of breaking off that phosphorus group, that adenosine diphosphate can get recharged with energy and phosphorus to create an ATP back again. So you're constantly cycling between ADP and ATP molecules. So it's a bit like a rechargeable battery. Now, how do you get from adenosine diphosphate to adenosine triphosphate? Well, many living organisms use cellular respiration, which is a way in which they can break down molecules to capture small amounts of energy. Now, don't be confused with the term respiration, because you might think of respiration as breathing, to respire, but respiration on a cellular level is quite a bit different. So where does respiration occur? Broadly, the mitochondria are the sites of cellular respiration, and they have structures that allow them to create the circumstances that will allow those chemical reactions to proceed really well. So a mitochondria is found in a eukaryotic cell, and it's got a double membrane. It has an outer membrane and it has an inner membrane. The inner membrane actually has folds in it called cristae, and so from the outside it can look like this, with little stacks. Now those cristae increase the surface area of the inner membrane, and that becomes important because the more inner membrane that you can fold into that area, the more space you have for one of the parts of the cellular respiration cycle. In the very, very center of the mitochondria is what we refer to as the matrix. Between the inner membrane and the outer membrane is what we refer to as the intermembrane space. So you need to know those structures because it will become important later. So the general equation for cellular respiration is this: you take a glucose molecule and you add oxygen to it. Several different steps occur, and you form carbon dioxide as a waste product, water as a waste product, and ATP, which is your energy. Now, there are many other ways in which organisms can create ATP. This particular equation is for what we call aerobic, or AER, aerobic respiration. And we call it aerobic because it involves oxygen. There are also several types of anaerobic respiration. One common type is in your body, if you start working out and you get that lactic acid buildup in your legs, you're working out so fast that your body can't pull oxygen to process glucose, and so what it does is it partially processes the glucose in the absence of oxygen, and that creates lactic acid that then has to get broken down more. Another example of non-aerobic or anaerobic respiration is yeast fermentation. So you'll actually be playing with yeast fermentation in one of your labs, the one this week, where you take yeast and sugar, and the yeast have an enzyme called zymase, and it helps to break down sucrose into glucose and fructose. And then there's another enzyme that partially breaks down the glucose into ethanol. So when you have yeast with sugar, one of its byproducts is actually ethanol. Of course, that's how we make beer. And when you make bread, it's the same equation, except for in bread, the thing that's interesting and of importance is actually the carbon dioxide, not the alcohol. And as soon as you pop that loaf of bread into the oven, the alcohol evaporates away. But cellular respiration, this is aerobic respiration, and you should know glucose plus oxygen gives you carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Now, we call this a redox reaction. Redox stands for reduction oxidation, and it's because each of the players goes through a version of reduction or oxidation. The glucose becomes oxidized, it loses electrons and hydrogens, and it gains oxygen. The oxygen is reduced in that it gains electrons and hydrogens. One way to remember whether or not something is oxidized or reduced is the little mnemonic oil rig. Oxidation is loss of electrons, reduction is gain of electrons. So here's an overview of aerobic respiration, which can occur both in plant cells and in animal cells. Plants have to break down glucose to form ATP as well, and they have mitochondria in them. So there are 3 steps that you need to know. The first is called glycolysis, the second step is called the citric acid cycle, and the third step is called electron transport. Electron transport is where most of the ATP is actually made. So let's have a look. Glycolysis is where glucose is broken into 2 pyruvic acid molecules. This actually occurs in the cytoplasm. The mitochondria only becomes important when those pyruvic acid molecules go inside the mitochondria, and they go through a series of different processings where the molecule is sequentially broken down, and a small amount of ATP is made by that. But what's really important is there's a compound called NADH, and NADH carries energy and electrons to something called an electron transport chain. And that electron transport chain occurs on the membranes of the inner membrane. So those long cristae become quite important, because the more cristae you have, the more locations you can have for electron transport. So that's the end of this slide. One thing that I think you'll find very important and helpful for this lecture is to watch the BioFlix animations and to draw out the parts of cellular respiration by hand. So I highly recommend that you do that.